Good morning, children. So once again, revision session, children. This is English for class 11. Let us revise the story, The Address. So let's begin, children. The story, The Address, is all about human predicament that follows the war. The story narrates how a daughter goes to her native place in Holland in search of her mother's belongings after the war. At the beginning of the story, it is narrated how the protagonist was given a cold reception when she went to her native place after the war in search of her mother's belongings. After ringing the bell of house number 46 in Marconi Street, a woman opened the door. On being introduced, the woman kept staring at her in silence. So there was no sign of recognition on her face. The woman was wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. The narrator could understand that she had made no mistake. She asked the woman whether she knew her mother. The woman could not deny this. The narrator wanted to talk to her for some time, but the woman cautiously closed the door. Very carefully, what did she do? She closed the door. The narrator stopped there for some time and then left the place. In the subsequent sections, the memories of the narrator's bygone days come to light. Her mother had provided the address years ago during the war. She went to the home for a few days. She could find that various things were missing. At the time, her mother told her about Mrs. Darling. She happened to be an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother. Lately, she had renewed contact with her and had been coming there regularly. Every time she left their house, she took something home with her. She told that. What did she tell? Come on, tell me, you remember the story? She told that she wanted to save all their nice possessions. So the next day, the narrator saw Mrs. Darling going out of the house with a heavy suitcase. She had a fleeting glimpse of Mrs. Darling's face. She asked her mother whether the woman lived far away. At the time, the narrator's mother told about the address. What address did she tell her? Number 46 Marconi Street. With this intention, she went to the given address. The concluding part of the story describes the second visit of the narrator. So, as the narrator's first visit yielded no result, so she planned to go once again. Interestingly, a girl of 15 opened the door to her. Her mother was not at home. The narrator expressed her wish to wait for her. The girl accompanied her to the passage. The narrator saw an old-fashioned iron candle holder hanging next to the mirror. The girl made her sit in the living room and went inside. The narrator was horrified to find herself in a room she knew and did not know. She found herself in the midst of familiar things which she longed to see again, but which troubled her in the strange atmosphere. She had no courage to look around her, but she no longer had the desire to possess them. She got up, walked to the door, and left the room. She resolved to forget the address and moved on in life. Let's have a look at some of the questions and answers of this story. "Have you come back?" said the woman. "I thought that no one had come back." Does this statement give some clue about the story? If yes, what is it? What is the clue? Yes, this statement gives some clue about the story. During the early part of the war, Mrs. Darling had shifted the important belongings of her acquaintance, Mrs. S, from her house to 46 Marconi Street. These included tables, silverwares, antique plates, and other nice things such as iron anuka candle holder, woolen tablecloth, and green knitted cardigan with wooden buttons. Since Mrs. S had died during the war, Mrs. Darling did not expect anyone to come back and claim her costly belongings, as she thought no one else knew her address. The statement indicates the greedy and possessive nature of Mrs. Darling. She did not open the door to the daughter of a former acquaintance, nor did she show any signs of recognition. She refused to recognize her daughter. She did not let the girl in. She refused to see her, then saying it was not convenient for her to do. The narrator had gone to this address with a specific purpose: to see her mother's belongings. Even when she told Mrs. Darling that only she had come back, the woman with a broad back did not soften a bit. Thus, the clash of interests is hinted at by the aforesaid statement. Now, the next question, children. The story is divided into pre-war and post-war. Pre-war, before war; post-war, after the war. What hardships do you think the girl underwent during these times? Let's have a look at the answer. During the pre-war times, the narrator lived in some other city far away from home, and she visited her mother only for a few days. During the first half of the war, the narrator's mother was always afraid that they might have to leave the place and lose all valuable belongings. The narrator lived in the city in a small rented room. Its windows were covered with blackout paper. She could not see the beauty of nature outside her room. The threat of death loomed large. After the liberation, everything became normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color. She could sleep in her bed without any fear of death. She could glance out of the window of her room each day. One day, she was eager to see all the possessions of her mother, which she knew were stored at number 46 Marconi Street. She went to that address. She felt disappointed when Mrs. Darling neither recognized her nor let her in. She asked her to come again some day. It was evident she wanted to put her off. She was eager to see, touch, and remember her mother's possessions. So she had to take the trouble of visiting the place again. Why did the narrator of the story want to forget the address? The narrator remembered the address her mother had told her only once. It was number 46 Marconi Street. Her mother's acquaintance, Mrs. Darling, lived there. She had stored the valuable belongings of the narrator's mother there. After her mother's death, the narrator had an urge to visit the place. She wanted to see those things, touch them, and remember. She went to the given address twice. She was successful in her second attempt to enter the living room. She found herself in the midst of things she wanted to see again. She felt oppressed in the strange atmosphere. Everything was arranged in a tasteless way. The ugly furniture and the muggy smell that hung there seemed quite unpleasant. These objects evoked the memory of the familiar life of former time. That is when her mother was alive, but they lost their value since they had been separated from her mother and stored in strange surroundings. She no longer wanted to see, touch, or remember these belongings. She resolved to forget the address. She wanted to leave the past behind and decided to move on. The next question. The address is a story of human predicament that follows war. Comment. Very important question, children. The war creates many difficult and unpleasant situations of human beings. Sometimes it becomes difficult to know what to do. The human predicament that follows war is amply illustrated through the experience of the narrator. The war had caused many physical difficulties as well as emotional sufferings to her. She had lost her dear mother. She went to 46 Marconi Street to see her mother's valuable possessions. How greedy and callous human beings can become is exemplified by the behavior of Mrs. Darling. She had stored all her valuable belongings of the narrator's mother, but she refused to recognize the narrator. She did not even let her in. The presence of her mother's possessions in strange atmosphere pained her. Now these valuables had lost all their importance for her as they had been separated from her mother. She could get no solace or comfort from them. Let's have a look at these short answer type questions. Children, how did Mrs. Darling react when the narrator said, Mrs. S.'s daughter? Mrs. Darling held her hand on the door as if she wanted to prevent it from opening any further. Her face showed no sign of recognition. She kept staring at the narrator without uttering a word. What two reasons did the narrator give to explain that she was mistaken? She thought that perhaps the woman was not Mrs. Darling. She had seen her only once for a brief interval, that too 2 years ago. Second, it was probable that she had rung the wrong bell. Yes. How did the narrator conclude that she was right? She understood by looking at what? The knitted cardigan, the green knitted cardigan of the narrator's mother. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that the narrator was looking at the cardigan. She half hid herself again behind the door. Her reaction convinced the narrator that she was right. What was the outcome of the interview between Mrs. Darling and the narrator? The interview was a flop as far as the narrator was concerned. Mrs. Darling refused to see her and talk to her. She refused to see her. She even refused to talk to her in spite of the narrator's repeated requests. Who had given the narrator the address when and under what circumstances? The narrator's mother had given her the address years ago during the first half of the war. The narrator came home for a few days and missed various things in the rooms. Then her mother told her about Mrs. Darling and gave her the address. What did the narrator learn about Mrs. Darling from her? Mrs. Darling was an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother. The latter had not seen her for several years. Then she suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Every time she left that place, she took something with her. Table, silver, antique plates, and all that. What reason did Mrs. Darling give for taking away the precious belongings of the narrator's mother? Mrs. Darling suggested to the narrator's mother that she should store the belongings at a safer place. She wanted to save all her nice things. She explained that they would lose everything if they had to leave the place. What impression do you form of the narrator's mother on the basis of her conversation with Mrs. Darling and the narrator? So here's the answer, children. The narrator's mother was a kind-hearted, generous and liberal lady. She was fond of collecting valuable things. She is more worried about the physical risk to Mrs. Darling than losing them to her. She thought it an insult to tell her friends to keep those things forever. Did the narrator feel convinced about the views of her mother regarding Mrs. Darling? How do you know that? How can you say that? The narrator did not feel convinced about her mother's concern for Mrs. Darling. The latter was keen on removing the precious possessions of the narrator's mother to her own house. It seems that the narrator did not like Mrs. Darling. So she did not like her excessive interest. Yes, about her concern for Mrs. Darling. Okay. So this is evident from the question she puts to her mother. What does the narrator remember about Mrs. Darling as she saw her for the first time? Mrs. Darling was a woman with a broad back. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. She picked up a heavy suitcase lying under the coat rack and left their house. She lived at number 46 Marconi Street. Why did the narrator wait a long time before going to the address? Number 46 Marconi Street. Initially, after the liberation, she was not at all interested in her mother's belongings lying stored there. She was also afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to her mother, who was now no more. When did the narrator become curious about her mother's possessions? The narrator became curious about her mother's possessions as normalcy returned in the post-liberation period. She knew that those things must still be at the address her mother told her. She wanted to see them, touch and remember. I was in a room I knew and did not know, says the narrator in the story The Address. What prompted her to make this observation? The narrator found herself in the midst of things she was familiar with and which she did want to see again. However, she found them in a strange atmosphere where everything was arranged in a tasteless way. The ugly furniture and the muggy smell created the feeling that she did not know the room. Yes, I just looked at the still life over the tea table, says the narrator. In the story The Address, what does she mean by the still life? What prompted her to make this remark? By the still life, the narrator meets the things over the tea table, such as tablecloth, teapot, cups and spoons. The reference to the antique box and silver spoons prompted her to make this remark. So, children, what did we do in this session? The story, the summary in brief, then questions and answers, both long answer type and short answer type. Very important from the point of view of examination. Write down in your notebooks, go through the questions and answers so that you're thorough with the lesson and so that you do not face any difficulty in the examination, children. That's all. Thank you. Goodbye.